For 18 years, Carmen Rodriguez had been fixing trucks at Sullivan's heavy-duty repair. The other mechanics treated her like she barely knew a torque wrench from a tire iron. They had no idea that the quiet woman changing oil and rotating tires was actually a decorated combat engineer who had kept armored convoys running through the deadliest roads in Afghanistan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carmen Rodriguez arrived at Sullivan's heavy-duty repair every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp, just like she had for the past 18 years. At 52 years old, with graying brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail and oil-stained coveralls that hung loose on her compact frame, she blended seamlessly into the background of the bustling truck repair shop. That's exactly how she preferred it: invisible, efficient, and left alone to do her work. The shop sat on the outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina, a weathered building with corrugated metal siding and a parking lot perpetually filled with disabled 18-wheelers, delivery trucks, and the occasional military vehicle from nearby Fort Bragg. The morning air always carried the familiar scent of diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of welding work that had become Carmen's daily soundtrack. "Morning, Rodriguez," grunted Mike Sullivan, the shop owner, as Carmen picked up her toolbox from the equipment locker. Sullivan was a decent enough boss, paid fair wages, didn't ask too many questions, and had given Carmen steady work when she desperately needed it 18 years ago. But even he treated her like part of the shop's fixtures, reliable, but unremarkable. "Morning, Mike," Carmen replied quietly, her voice barely audible over the pneumatic tools already screaming to life in the adjacent bay. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself only led to complications she couldn't afford. Ryan Brooks, the shop's lead mechanic and self-appointed expert on everything automotive, was already holding court near the coffee machine, entertaining the younger mechanics with another story about his supposed mechanical prowess. At 38, Brooks stood 6 feet tall with the kind of loud confidence that filled every room he entered. He'd been at Sullivan's for 8 years and never let anyone forget that he was the highest-paid mechanic on staff. "So there I was," Brooks was saying to Danny Martinez and Kevin Walsh, 2 mechanics in their 20s who hung on his every word. "Transmission completely shot on this Peterbilt, driver swearing it couldn't be fixed. 3 other shops had already given up on it. But old Ryan here, I took one look under that hood and knew exactly what the problem was." Carmen walked past the group toward her assigned bay, invisible as always. She'd heard variations of this same story dozens of times, each telling making Brooks sound more heroic and the mechanical problem more impossible to solve. The truth was that Carmen had diagnosed the same transmission issue from across the shop just by listening to the engine noise when the truck had first arrived, but she'd learned to keep such observations to herself. "Rodriguez!" Brooks called out, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he wanted to assert his authority. "That Ford pickup in Bay 3 needs a brake job. Should be simple enough even for you. Try not to mess it up, yeah?" Carmen nodded silently, already assessing the vehicle from across the shop floor. Even from this distance, she could tell by the way it sat that the problem went deeper than just brake pads. The slight forward lean suggested issues with the brake fluid system, possibly a master cylinder problem that would require a complete system flush and component replacement. But pointing that out would only earn her Brooks's resentment and the other mechanic's skepticism. She had learned this lesson the hard way during her first months at Sullivan's. Eager to prove herself and still adjusting to civilian life, Carmen had made the mistake of offering technical insights that went beyond what was expected from someone in her position. The suggestion that a customer's steering problem stemmed from worn suspension components rather than simple wheel alignment had been met with dismissive laughter. When her diagnosis proved correct and saved the customer from a potentially dangerous failure, the reaction wasn't gratitude, but suspicion and resentment. "Just stay in your lane, Rodriguez," Brooks had told her after that incident. "Stick to oil changes and tire rotations. Leave the real mechanical work to those of us who actually know what we're doing." From that point forward, Carmen had retreated into the background, performing her assigned tasks with quiet competence while keeping her deeper knowledge to herself. She changed oil, rotated tires, performed basic maintenance, and watched as the other mechanics struggled with problems she could have solved in minutes. It was a daily exercise in patience that reminded her of the discipline she'd learned during her years in the military, though for very different reasons. The morning routine at Sullivan's followed a predictable pattern. Brooks would assign the simple, low-paying jobs to Carmen while reserving the complex, high-margin repairs for himself and his favorite apprentices. The other mechanics followed his lead, treating Carmen like an experienced but limited technician who was useful for routine maintenance, but not much else. "Rodriguez, when you're done with that brake job, there's a stack of oil changes waiting," Brooks announced, not bothering to look up from the engine he was working on. "Danny here is going to tackle the transmission rebuild on the Mack truck. Real mechanics work, you understand." Carmen understood perfectly, though not in the way Brooks intended. She understood that Danny Martinez, despite his enthusiasm, lacked the experience to properly rebuild a heavy-duty transmission without guidance. She understood that the shortcuts Brooks took on his expert repairs often created problems that customers would discover weeks later. Most importantly, she understood that her role in this shop was to remain invisible and competent, collecting her paycheck while avoiding the complications that came with standing out. As she worked on the Ford pickup's brake system, Carmen's hands moved with practiced efficiency that came from years of experience. Not just the 18 years at Sullivan's, but the years before that, years she never talked about, years that would have shocked her co-workers if they'd known the truth. Her fingers found worn components by feel, diagnosed problems through subtle vibrations and sounds that others missed, and applied techniques learned in conditions far more challenging than any civilian repair shop. The brake job that Brooks had estimated would take Carmen most of the morning was completed in 2 hours, including the master cylinder replacement that he hadn't even diagnosed. She performed the additional work without charging extra time, knowing that calling attention to Brooks's oversight would only create problems for herself. "Finished already?" Kevin Walsh asked, genuinely surprised as he watched Carmen clean her tools. At 24, Kevin was the youngest mechanic at Sullivan's and one of the few who occasionally treated Carmen with basic courtesy. "That was fast work." "Just brakes," Carmen replied simply, not mentioning the additional repairs she'd performed. Nothing complicated. But Kevin had been watching, and he'd noticed that Carmen's simple brake job had involved component replacements and system procedures that went well beyond routine pad replacement. He'd also noticed that her work area was always organized, her tools properly maintained, and her repairs performed with a precision that made even Brooks's best work look sloppy by comparison. "Hey, Carmen," Kevin said quietly, making sure Brooks couldn't overhear, "where did you learn to work on vehicles? You've got some serious skills that seem like they came from somewhere more than just working here." For a moment, Carmen's hands paused in their methodical tool cleaning. It was the kind of question she'd been avoiding for 18 years, the kind of innocent inquiry that could lead to conversations she wasn't prepared to have. Her past was a door she'd deliberately closed, sealed behind layers of carefully maintained normalcy and deliberate invisibility. "Just picked things up over the years," she said finally, her voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. "Experience teaches you things." Kevin nodded, sensing that he'd touched on something Carmen didn't want to discuss. But he filed away his observations, adding them to a growing list of things about the shop's most overlooked mechanic that didn't quite add up. The way she could diagnose problems by sound alone, the efficiency of her movements, the advanced techniques she used when she thought no one was watching. Most tellingly, the fact that her repair work never came back with customer complaints, unlike some of the more celebrated mechanics in the shop. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Carmen continued her routine of invisible competence. She completed assigned tasks ahead of schedule, quietly fixed problems that others had missed, and maintained the low profile that had served her well for nearly 2 decades. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more oil changes, more tire rotations, more opportunities to watch skilled problems being solved by less experienced mechanics while she remained in the background. But Carmen Rodriguez had learned patience during years when patience meant survival. She had learned to value invisibility during times when being noticed could mean death. Most importantly, she had learned that expertise didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply performed, day after day, year after year, waiting for the moment when quiet competence would finally be recognized for what it truly was. The afternoon sun slanted through the shop's windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where Carmen worked. In a few hours, she would clock out, drive home to her small apartment, and prepare for another day of being overlooked and underestimated. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring visitors who would recognize not just her skills, but the deeper story behind them. Visitors who carried photographs that would shatter 18 years of carefully maintained invisibility and reveal the truth about the quiet woman who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The next morning brought the familiar symphony of diesel engines, air compressors, and the metallic clang of tools that had become the soundtrack of Carmen's adult life. But today carried an undercurrent of tension that she recognized immediately, the kind of energy that preceded either celebration or catastrophe in any workplace. Ryan Brooks stood near the coffee machine, his voice carrying across the shop floor with unusual intensity. "I'm telling you guys, Sullivan's thinking about bringing in some hotshot consultant to evaluate our procedures," he said, making air quotes with oil-stained fingers. "Probably some college kid with a business degree who's never turned a wrench in his life." Danny Martinez looked up from the engine he was working on, concern evident in his young face. "Does that mean layoffs? My girlfriend's pregnant, man. I need this job." "Relax, rookie," Brooks replied with the kind of casual confidence that came from being the shop's golden boy. "They're not getting rid of real mechanics. It's the dead weight they'll cut first." His eyes drifted meaningfully toward Carmen's corner of the shop, where she was methodically organizing her tools for the day's work. Carmen heard every word but continued her routine, checking fluid levels and inspecting equipment with the same thorough attention to detail that had kept her alive in far more dangerous situations. She'd weathered 18 years of Brooks's casual cruelty in workplace politics. One more evaluation wouldn't change her approach to the work itself. Kevin Walsh, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up with characteristic honesty. "Brooks, Carmen's got the lowest comeback rate in the shop. Customers specifically request her for warranty work because they know it'll be done right the first time." "That's because she only does the easy stuff," Brooks shot back immediately. "Oil changes and brake pads don't require real mechanical knowledge. Anyone can follow a manual for that kind of work." The comment stung not because it was cruel, but because it was so fundamentally wrong. Carmen had performed some of the most complex mechanical repairs in hostile conditions that would have challenged any civilian mechanic. But she couldn't defend herself without opening doors to conversations she'd spent 18 years avoiding. Mike Sullivan emerged from his office, clipboard in hand and the expression of a man dealing with problems he'd rather avoid. "Listen up, people. We've got a situation developing. Military convoy broke down about 10 miles out, and they need emergency repairs on multiple vehicles. Big contract, good money, but it's got to be done right and done fast." Brooks immediately straightened up, sensing opportunity. "What kind of vehicles, Mike?" "I've worked on plenty of military trucks. Probably just routine maintenance issues." Sullivan consulted his clipboard with obvious skepticism. 3 HMMWVs with transmission problems, 2 cargo trucks with engine failures, and something called an MRAP with hydraulic issues. The convoy commander says they need to be back on the road by tomorrow morning or it compromises their training schedule. The shop fell silent. Carmen's hands stilled on the wrench she'd been cleaning, her attention fully focused on Sullivan's description. HMMWVs and MRAPs weren't standard civilian vehicles. They were military workhorses designed for combat conditions, with specialized components and maintenance requirements that most civilian mechanics had never encountered. "MRAP?" Danny asked, confusion evident in his voice. "What's that?" "Mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle," Carmen answered automatically, then immediately regretted speaking. Every eye in the shop turned toward her with surprise. Brooks recovered first, his expression shifting to amused condescension. "Look who's been watching Discovery Channel. What's next, Rodriguez? Gonna tell us you've worked on tanks too?" The laughter that followed felt familiar and predictable, but Carmen noticed that Kevin wasn't joining in. Instead, he was studying her with the same curious expression he'd worn yesterday when questioning her background. "How did you know that?" Kevin asked quietly. Carmen shrugged, trying to deflect attention back to her tools. "Just something I heard somewhere." But the damage was done. Her precise, immediate identification of a specialized military vehicle had created a small crack in the carefully constructed image of limited competence she'd maintained for nearly 2 decades. Sullivan, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued his briefing. "The convoy's going to arrive here in about 2 hours. I'm putting Brooks in charge of the operation. He's got the most experience with complex repairs. Rodriguez, You'll assist with basic maintenance tasks. Everyone else, clear your schedules. This is all hands on deck until we get them back on the road." Brooks nodded with obvious satisfaction, already planning how to maximize his visibility on such a high-profile contract. "Don't worry, Mike. I'll have those military boys back on the road in no time. Probably just standard wear and tear that got blown out of proportion." Carmen continued organizing her tools, but her mind was already assessing the challenges ahead. MRAP hydraulic systems were notoriously complex, designed to function in extreme conditions with multiple redundancies and specialized components. The transmission problems in military HMMWVs often stemmed from issues that civilian mechanics wouldn't recognize because they involved modifications specific to combat operations. Most concerning was Brooks's obvious confidence in his ability to handle vehicles he'd likely never encountered. His mechanical skills were adequate for civilian trucks and standard maintenance, but military vehicles operated under different parameters with components that required specialized knowledge. "Hey, Carmen," Kevin said, approaching her workstation while the others continued discussing the incoming contract. "You seem to know a lot about that MRAP thing. Have you ever actually worked on military vehicles?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Carmen wasn't prepared to address. Kevin's curiosity was innocent enough, but answering honestly would require explanations that could unravel 18 years of careful anonymity. "I've seen them around Fort Bragg," she said finally. "You pick up information over the years." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Carmen had indeed seen MRAPs around Fort Bragg, from the inside, as the person responsible for keeping them operational during some of the most dangerous missions in modern military history. Brooks, overhearing the conversation, inserted himself with characteristic bluster. "Rodriguez, stick to what you know. We're going to be working on serious equipment here, not the kind of basic maintenance you're used to. I don't want you getting in over your head and embarrassing the shop." Carmen nodded silently, but Kevin noticed something in her expression, a flicker of what might have been amusement, quickly suppressed. It was the look of someone who knew far more than they were letting on. As the morning progressed, the shop buzzed with preparation for the military contract. Brooks held court, dispensing advice about working with military personnel and sharing stories of his supposed experience with, quote, government vehicles. The younger mechanics listened with rapt attention, while Carmen continued her routine tasks with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her tenure at Sullivan's. But something had shifted in the shop's dynamics. Kevin's questions had planted seeds of curiosity that were beginning to grow, and Carmen's inadvertent knowledge of military terminology had created hairline cracks in the facade she'd maintained for so long. The morning air outside carried the distant rumble of heavy vehicles approaching, the sound of diesel engines under load, the distinctive noise of military convoys moving with purpose and precision. Carmen recognized the sound immediately, though she couldn't have explained how, without revealing far more about herself than she was prepared to share. In 2 hours, soldiers would arrive at Sullivan's heavy-duty repair, bringing with them vehicles that represented some of the most advanced military engineering in the world. They would expect professional service from qualified mechanics, unaware that the most qualified person in the shop was the quiet woman in the corner who had been dismissed and overlooked for 18 years. The stage was set for a collision between Carmen's carefully maintained anonymity and the specialized knowledge that defined her true expertise. The only question was whether she could continue hiding in plain sight when confronted with the very world she'd once called home. The rumble of approaching vehicles grew steadily louder until it dominated every conversation in Sullivan's heavy-duty repair. Through the bay doors, Carmen could see a dust cloud rising from the access road, the distinctive signature of a military convoy moving at speed across unpaved terrain. The sound triggered memories she'd spent 18 years trying to suppress, but her hands remained steady as she continued her preparation routine. "Here they come," Danny Martinez announced unnecessarily, his voice carrying the nervous excitement of someone about to encounter something beyond his normal experience. "Man, look at the size of those things." The convoy that rolled into Sullivan's parking lot was impressive by any standard. 3 desert tan HMMWVs led the formation, their angular armor plating and reinforced windows marking them as up-armored variants designed for combat operations. Behind them came 2 larger cargo trucks, heavy-duty military variants that dwarfed most civilian vehicles. Bringing up the rear was the MRAP that had captured everyone's attention, a massive vehicle that looked more like an armored spaceship than a truck. Carmen watched the arrival through the corner of her eye, noting details that her coworkers missed. The way the vehicles maintained precise spacing even while parking. The coordinated dismount of personnel who moved with the fluid efficiency of a well-trained unit. Most tellingly, the immediate security perimeter they established while assessing their surroundings, behaviors that marked these soldiers as something more than standard military transport personnel. Staff Sergeant Derek Johnson emerged from the lead HMMWV, his desert combat uniform bearing the subdued patches and insignia of an active-duty ranger. At 35, Johnson carried himself with the controlled confidence of someone who had operated in the world's most dangerous environments. His eyes swept the repair shop with professional assessment, cataloging exits, personnel, and potential threats with the automatic awareness that never fully switched off. "You Sullivan?" Johnson asked, approaching Mike with the direct manner of someone accustomed to cutting through civilian pleasantries. "That's me," Mike replied, clearly intimidated by the military presence but trying to project business confidence. "Mike Sullivan, owner and operator. We're ready to get your vehicles back on the road, Sergeant." "Staff Sergeant," Johnson corrected mildly, "and I appreciate that. We've got a tight timeline here. Need to be wheels up by 0600 tomorrow for continuation of training operations. Can your people handle specialized military systems?" Brooks stepped forward before Mike could respond, his chest puffed with exaggerated confidence. "Staff Sergeant, I'm Ryan Brooks, lead mechanic. I've been working on heavy vehicles for over 15 years. Military, civilian, doesn't matter. An engine's an engine, right?" Carmen cringed internally at Brooks's casual dismissal of the complexities involved in military vehicle maintenance. Military systems operated under parameters that civilian mechanics rarely encountered, with components designed for conditions that pushed every specification to its absolute limit. Johnson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Carmen caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated skepticism. Rangers learned early to distinguish between competence and overconfidence, and Brooks's bravado was raising red flags that only someone with military experience would recognize. "Right," Johnson said noncommittally. "Let me introduce you to my team. Sergeant First Class Lisa Turner, our convoy commander." He gestured to a woman emerging from the 2nd HMMWV, compact, efficient, with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of keeping equipment operational in hostile environments. "Captain James Mitchell, our officer in charge." The captain was younger than his NCOs, but carried himself with the earned authority of someone who had proven himself in combat operations. His handshake with Mike was firm but brief, his attention already shifting to assess the shop's capabilities. "Staff Sergeant, what kind of problems are we looking at?" Mike asked, pulling out his work order forms with obvious eagerness to begin what could be a substantial contract. Johnson consulted a field notebook, his manner shifting to professional briefing mode. "HMMWV Alpha has transmission slipping, particularly under load. Bravo has intermittent power loss that suggests fuel system contamination. Charlie's got electrical gremlins affecting the communications package." Brooks nodded with apparent understanding, though Carmen noticed he was already in over his head. Military HMMWV transmissions operated under different specifications than civilian vehicles, particularly the up-armored variants that carried additional weight and stress loads. "The cargo trucks," Johnson continued, "are showing signs of injector problems and what looks like turbocharger failure on the lead vehicle. Both are running rough and down on power." "And the MRAP?" Mike asked, eyeing the massive vehicle with obvious trepidation. "Hydraulic system failure affecting the independent suspension and mine blast protection systems," Sergeant First Class Turner answered, speaking for the first time. Her voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had dealt with similar problems in much less convenient circumstances. "It's a complex system, multiple pumps, redundant circuits, and specialized components that require specific diagnostic procedures." The shop fell silent as the full scope of the work became apparent. These weren't routine maintenance issues that could be addressed with standard civilian procedures. Each vehicle presented challenges that required specialized knowledge of military systems, components, and operational requirements. Brooks, realizing he was facing complexity beyond his experience, tried to maintain his confident facade. "Well, we'll need to get our hands dirty and see what we're dealing with. Military or not, These are still just vehicles with engines, transmissions, and hydraulic systems. Carmen watched Staff Sergeant Johnson's reaction with growing concern. The ranger's expression had shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed doubt about the shop's capabilities. Rangers didn't have time for learning curves or trial-and-error approaches to critical equipment repairs. "Staff Sergeant," Captain Mitchell interjected, "maybe we should consider other options. These vehicles need to be mission-ready, not just functional." The comment hung in the air like a challenge to the shop's competence. Mike Sullivan's face reddened with embarrassment and the potential loss of a significant contract, while Brooks scrambled to reassure military personnel who were clearly questioning their decision to stop at this particular repair facility. "Gentlemen, I guarantee we can handle your equipment," Brooks said with desperate confidence. "I've worked on everything from semis to construction equipment. Once I get under the hood, I'll have your problems diagnosed in no time." But Carmen could see the Rangers exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of Brooks's overconfidence. These were professionals who had learned to recognize competence quickly and accurately, and what they were seeing wasn't inspiring confidence in their equipment's future. Sergeant First Class Turner approached the MRAP and began pointing out specific components to Captain Mitchell, their conversation conducted in the technical shorthand of people who understood both the equipment and the consequences of its failure. Carmen found herself listening despite her intention to remain inconspicuous. "The primary hydraulic pump is showing pressure fluctuations," Turner was saying. "Could be contamination in the system, but with this much variance, I'm thinking we've got component failure in the distribution block." Carmen's hands stilled on her tools. Turner's diagnosis was partially correct, but she was missing a critical factor. MRAP hydraulic systems in that configuration typically failed due to seal degradation in the accumulator assembly, which created pressure fluctuations that mimicked distribution block problems. It was a common misdiagnosis that led to unnecessary component replacement and extended downtime. The knowledge was there, precise and immediate, drawn from hundreds of hours maintaining similar systems under conditions where mechanical failure meant life or death for everyone involved. But voicing that knowledge would require explanations Carmen wasn't prepared to give. Instead, she watched as Brooks approached the Rangers with his toolbox, ready to begin work on equipment he didn't understand for customers who were rapidly losing confidence in his capabilities. The collision between overconfidence and expertise was about to unfold, and Carmen knew it wouldn't end well for anyone involved. The Rangers had brought more than just broken vehicles to Sullivan's heavy-duty repair. They had brought a test of competence that would reveal the true capabilities of everyone in the shop, including the quiet woman in the corner, who possessed exactly the knowledge they needed, but had spent 18 years hiding it from the world. 2 hours into the diagnostic process, it became painfully clear that Sullivan's heavy-duty repair was in over its head. Brooks had spent 45 minutes staring at the HMMWV's transmission, consulting civilian repair manuals that bore little resemblance to the military-spec components he was encountering. Danny Martinez had managed to correctly identify the fuel contamination in Bravo vehicle, but had no idea how to properly flush and service the specialized filtration systems. Meanwhile, the MRAP sat untouched because no one in the shop was willing to admit they had no idea where to begin with its complex hydraulic array. Staff Sergeant Johnson stood near the shop's brake area, his patience wearing thin as he watched civilian mechanics struggle with equipment his Rangers could service in the field with basic tools. Captain Mitchell had already made 2 phone calls to alternative repair facilities, clearly preparing contingency plans for getting his convoy back on the road. "This is taking longer than expected," Johnson muttered to Sergeant First Class Turner, who was documenting the delays in her field notebook. "At this rate, we'll miss our movement window and compromise the entire training schedule." Turner nodded grimly. "Sir, maybe we should cut our losses and call for recovery vehicles. Get these birds back to Fort Bragg and let our own mechanics handle the repairs." The conversation wasn't exactly quiet, and Carmen could see Mike Sullivan's face growing redder with each passing minute. A military contract that had seemed like a financial windfall was rapidly becoming a humiliating demonstration of his shop's limitations. Brooks, sweating profusely and covered in hydraulic fluid from his unsuccessful attempts to access the MRAP's distribution block, finally approached the Rangers with desperate bravado. "Just need a little more time, Staff Sergeant. These military systems are more complex than I initially assessed, but I'm making progress." Johnson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Carmen caught the slight shake of his head that indicated his assessment of Brooks's capabilities had reached a definitive conclusion. Rangers didn't tolerate incompetence, especially when it affected mission readiness. "Staff Sergeant," Captain Mitchell said, approaching with his satellite phone in hand, "I've got recovery vehicles standing by. We can have these loaded and back to base within 3 hours." The announcement hit the shop like a physical blow. Not only would Sullivans lose the contract, but word would spread through the military community that they couldn't handle specialized equipment. The reputation damage could affect future business for years. Johnson sighed and began gathering his gear. "Turner, start prepping the vehicles for transport. We'll strip any sensitive equipment and—" "Before you do that," Turner interrupted, pulling her tablet from her cargo pocket, "let me show you something that might interest you." She had been reviewing mission photos from their recent deployment, part of an after-action report she was compiling for command. The images showed various combat operations where their vehicles had sustained damage and received field repairs under hostile conditions. "Check this out," Turner said, holding up the tablet to show Johnson and Mitchell. "Remember that convoy ambush outside Kandahar? When Alpha took that IED hit and we had to keep her running on manual hydraulics for 12 hours? The photo on the screen showed a heavily damaged MRAP, its armored hull scarred by shrapnel, surrounded by Rangers working frantically to restore mobility. But it was the figure kneeling beside the vehicle's hydraulic access panel that made Carmen's blood run cold. There, captured in digital clarity, was a combat engineer in desert camouflage, hands deep in the MRAP's hydraulic system, surrounded by the organized chaos of a field repair operation. The engineer's face was partially obscured by equipment and the harsh shadows of combat lighting, but the body language, the precise hand positioning, the methodical approach to the complex repair, all of it was unmistakably familiar. "That engineer saved our asses," Johnson said, studying the photo with obvious respect. "Never got their name, but they kept us mobile when we should have been deadlined for weeks. Knew those systems better than our own mechanics." Carmen felt the world tilt around her as memories came flooding back. The ambush, the desperate night-long repair operation, the satisfaction of keeping critical vehicles operational when lives depended on mobility, the pride she'd felt in applying skills learned through years of experience to save her fellow soldiers. She tried to turn away, to retreat to the safety of her workstation, but Kevin Walsh had been watching the Rangers with curiosity and caught sight of the photograph over Turner's shoulder. "Hey," Kevin said, his voice cutting through the shop noise with unusual intensity. "Can I see that picture?" Turner, assuming Kevin was just curious about military operations, handed over the tablet without thinking. Kevin studied the image for several long moments, his expression growing increasingly puzzled as he looked back and forth between the photo and Carmen's corner of the shop. "Carmen," Kevin called out, his voice carrying a strange note that made everyone in the shop turn toward him. "Come look at this. This engineer in the photo. Doesn't this look familiar to you?" Carmen felt every eye in the shop focus on her as Kevin's words hung in the air. The moment she'd been dreading for 18 years had arrived, triggered by a random photograph that should never have surfaced in a civilian repair shop in North Carolina. "I don't know what you mean," Carmen said quietly, not moving from her position near the workbench. But Kevin was holding up the tablet, comparing the figure in the combat photo to Carmen's posture and movements. The way this person is positioned, the hand placement on the hydraulic components. "Carmen, you were just working in exactly the same position on that brake system yesterday." Staff Sergeant Johnson's attention snapped from the tablet to Carmen, with the laser focus of someone who had learned to recognize critical details that others missed. His eyes swept over her with professional assessment, taking in details that suddenly seemed significant rather than routine. "Ma'am," Johnson said carefully, "Kevin's right. There is something familiar about your positioning and technique. Have we met before?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Carmen could feel 18 years of carefully constructed invisibility crumbling around her, as military-trained eyes began seeing past the civilian facade to the expertise that lay beneath. Turner took back the tablet and studied the photo more carefully, then looked at Carmen with growing recognition. "Staff Sergeant," she said slowly, "I think we need to ask this lady some specific questions about her background." Brooks, sensing that attention had shifted away from his mechanical failures, tried to reassert control of the situation. "Look, whatever game we're playing here, we've got work to do. Rodriguez, get back to your station. Let the real mechanics handle the military equipment." But Johnson raised a hand that silenced Brooks immediately. Rangers had developed an instinct for recognizing when situation parameters were changing. and something significant was happening that went beyond civilian repair shop dynamics. "Ma'am," Johnson said, approaching Carmen with the respectful directness of one professional addressing another, "I'm going to ask you a very specific question, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Have you ever served in a military capacity?" Carmen looked around the shop at faces filled with curiosity, skepticism, and anticipation. Mike Sullivan waited for her response with obvious concern about losing his contract. Brooks stood ready to dismiss whatever she might say. Kevin watched with genuine interest in learning the truth about his overlooked colleague. But it was the Rangers who mattered most. They were professionals who understood that expertise came in many forms, and that the most valuable knowledge often belonged to people who didn't advertise their capabilities. The photograph on Turner's tablet showed a moment from Carmen's past when her skills had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Now, faced with the same type of equipment and the same need for specialized knowledge, she had to decide whether to continue hiding or to finally acknowledge the expertise she'd been carrying in silence for 18 years. "Yes," Carmen said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the admission. "I served, combat engineer, vehicle recovery specialist, 3 tours, Afghanistan, 2003 to 2009. The shop fell completely silent except for the distant hum of air compressors. Carmen Rodriguez, the overlooked mechanic who had been changing oil and rotating tires for 18 years, had just revealed herself to be exactly the expert the Rangers needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed Carmen's admission stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Staff Sergeant Johnson stared at her with the intense focus of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew about a situation. Sergeant First Class Turner held her tablet like it contained the key to a mystery she was only beginning to understand. Most tellingly, Captain Mitchell stepped closer with the sudden interest of an officer who recognized that the parameters of their problem had just fundamentally changed. "Combat engineer," Johnson repeated slowly, his voice carrying new respect. "Vehicle recovery specialist, 3 tours in Afghanistan." He paused, studying Carmen's face with professional intensity. "What unit?" Carmen hesitated for a moment, knowing that her answer would either validate her claims or expose them as elaborate fiction. Military personnel could verify unit assignments, deployment schedules, and operational histories with a few phone calls. 832nd Engineer Company attached to various special operations units for vehicle recovery and maintenance support, she said quietly. Specialized in keeping mobility assets operational in contested environments. Turner's eyes widened with recognition. "Holy shit," she breathed, then immediately caught herself. "Sorry, ma'am, but the 832nd, you guys were legends. Every Ranger unit that operated in Afghanistan knew about your recovery teams. When conventional maintenance couldn't handle it, they called you." The transformation in the Rangers' demeanor was immediate and complete. The polite skepticism had vanished, replaced by the kind of professional respect that soldiers reserved for those who had proven themselves in combat conditions. Johnson straightened slightly, his body language shifting to acknowledge Carmen as a peer rather than a civilian contractor. "Ma'am," Captain Mitchell said formally, "if you're 832nd Engineer, then you've got more experience with these systems than anyone in this shop. Hell, more than most of our own mechanics back at Bragg." Brooks, who had been standing frozen in confusion since Carmen's revelation, finally found his voice. "Wait a minute. You're telling me Rodriguez has been some kind of military mechanic this whole time? That's impossible. She's been doing oil changes and brake jobs for 18 years. "Because that's what you assigned her to do," Kevin Walsh said quietly, pieces of a long puzzle finally clicking into place. "Brooks, think about it. How many times have you seen Carmen's work come back with problems? How many customers specifically request her for repairs? She's been doing perfect work on everything you've given her, but you've only given her the simple stuff." Carmen could see the wheels turning in Johnson's mind as he began to understand the situation. A highly trained combat engineer had been working in civilian capacity, her expertise hidden beneath routine maintenance tasks because no one had bothered to discover what she was truly capable of. "Ma'am," Johnson said respectfully, "can you tell us about your experience with MRAP hydraulic systems?" Carmen glanced around the shop, taking in the faces of people who had dismissed her capabilities for nearly 2 decades. Mike Sullivan looked stunned. Brooks appeared to be experiencing some kind of cognitive disconnect. Danny Martinez was staring at her like she'd just revealed superpowers. I spent 14 months as the primary MRAP maintenance specialist for a forward operating base in Helmand Province, Carmen said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about expertise she'd been hiding for so long. Average 6 vehicles per day, usually under mortar fire, with limited parts and no backup support. The hydraulic systems you're dealing with here are first generation compared to what we kept running in the field. Turner pulled up another photo on her tablet, this one showing a maintenance bay in what was clearly a combat zone. Ma'am, was this your operation? FOB Shank, 2007? Carmen looked at the image and felt a rush of memories, the constant pressure of keeping critical vehicles operational, the satisfaction of solving complex problems with improvised solutions, the pride of knowing that her work directly contributed to bringing soldiers home alive. That's my bay, she confirmed. Those MRAPs in the background. I rebuilt the entire hydraulic system on the lead vehicle 3 times in 6 months. IED damage, small arms fire, and pure wear from operating in conditions no manufacturer ever anticipated. The impact of this revelation on the Rangers was profound. They were looking at someone who had not only worked on their equipment, but had done so under conditions that made their current training exercise look like a peaceful afternoon. Ma'am, Captain Mitchell said, I have to ask, what happened? Why aren't you working with military contractors or government agencies? Your experience should have led to senior positions in defense maintenance. Carmen's expression darkened slightly, touching on memories that were more painful than her mechanical challenges. IED attack on our convoy in 2009. Lost 3 members of my team, including my closest friend and work partner. I survived, but the psychological evaluation determined I was no longer suitable for combat zone deployment. The shop fell silent again, but this time it was the respectful quiet that military personnel reserved for discussing fallen comrades and the costs of service. PTSD? Turner asked gently. Among other things, Carmen replied. The Army offered desk jobs, training positions, consulting work. But I needed distance from anything that reminded me of what we'd lost. Civilian work seemed like the safest option. Johnson nodded with understanding. He'd seen other combat veterans make similar choices, trading expertise for psychological safety, even when it meant accepting positions far below their capabilities. So you've been fixing trucks here for 18 years, he said, maintaining skills on civilian equipment while staying away from anything that might trigger difficult memories. Until today, Carmen said simply. Brooks, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally exploded with frustrated disbelief. This is insane! You're telling me that Rodriguez has been some kind of super mechanic this whole time, and she's been letting me make all the technical decisions? Why didn't you ever speak up? Why didn't you tell us you had this experience? Carmen turned to face Brooks directly, her expression carrying 18 years of accumulated patience and quiet dignity. Because you never asked. You assumed that because I was willing to do routine maintenance, that's all I was capable of. You created an environment where expertise was measured by how loudly someone talked about their abilities, not by the quality of their work. Kevin Walsh stepped forward, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and regret. Carmen, I've been watching you work for 2 years. You've been showing advanced techniques this whole time, haven't you? The diagnostic methods, the precision of your repairs, the way you organize your workspace, it all makes sense now. Military training doesn't disappear just because you change careers, Carmen said. Attention to detail, systematic problem solving, taking pride in your work, those habits become part of who you are. Mike Sullivan, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke up. Carmen, I had no idea. 18 years, and I never knew we had someone with your background on staff. Because you never needed to know, Carmen replied without bitterness. I did the job you hired me to do, and I did it well. That should have been enough. Staff Sergeant Johnson stepped forward with the decisive manner of someone who had just identified the solution to his problem. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you directly. Can you get our vehicles operational by tomorrow morning? Carmen looked at the Rangers, then at the broken-down military vehicles that represented the same challenges she'd faced hundreds of times in much more difficult circumstances. For the first time in 18 years, she was being asked to apply the full range of her expertise to equipment that truly needed her specialized knowledge. "Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "give me access to your vehicles in 6 hours, and I'll have your convoy ready for whatever mission you're running." The quiet mechanic who had been dismissed and overlooked for nearly 2 decades was finally ready to show the world what she could really do. What happened next would be talked about at Sullivan's heavy-duty repair for years to come. Carmen Rodriguez, who had spent 18 years being treated as a competent but limited maintenance worker, transformed before everyone's eyes into something entirely different. A master technician operating at a level that none of her civilian colleagues had ever witnessed. She began with the MRAP, the vehicle that had stymied Brooks completely and represented the most complex challenge in the convoy. As she approached the massive armored vehicle, her entire demeanor changed. Gone was the quiet deference that had characterized her interactions for nearly 2 decades. In its place was the focused intensity of a professional applying expertise earned through years of high-stakes experience. "Kevin," Carmen said, her voice carrying new authority, "I need you to bring me the hydraulic pressure tester from Bay 4. Danny, get the advanced diagnostic scanner from the equipment room, the military spec one that Brooks never uses because he says it's too complicated." The younger mechanics moved immediately, responding to the confidence in Carmen's voice with an alacrity they'd never shown when taking orders from Brooks. Even more telling, Brooks himself stepped back, apparently recognizing that he was watching something beyond his comprehension. Staff Sergeant Johnson positioned himself where he could observe Carmen's work without interfering. Rangers learned early to recognize expertise when they saw it, and what he was witnessing matched the skill level of the best military mechanics he'd encountered during his career. Carmen opened the MRAP's hydraulic access panel with the fluid movements of someone who had performed this action hundreds of times. Her hands moved directly to specific components without hesitation, checking connection points and pressure readings with systematic efficiency that spoke of extensive experience. "Turner was right about the pressure fluctuations," Carmen said, addressing the Rangers while she worked, "but the root cause isn't in the distribution block. It's seal degradation in the accumulator assembly, probably caused by contaminated fluid that got past the primary filtration system." She indicated specific components as she spoke, her explanation accompanied by the kind of precise diagnostic work that military maintenance required. "See these scoring marks on the piston rod? That's from debris that made it through compromised seals. The distribution block symptoms are secondary. The system is trying to compensate for pressure loss upstream." Sergeant First Class Turner leaned closer, following Carmen's explanation with obvious professional interest. "Ma'am, that's exactly the kind of diagnostic insight our own mechanics struggle with. How did you identify that so quickly?" "Because I've seen this exact failure mode about 50 times, Carmen replied, already beginning disassembly procedures with practiced efficiency. "Desert operations are brutal on hydraulic seals. Fine sand gets everywhere, contamination is constant, and you learn to recognize failure patterns by the symptoms they create." Brooks, who had been watching in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "Rodriguez, you've been working here for 18 years. How is it possible that you know these systems better than our technical manuals?" Carmen paused her work to look at Brooks directly. "Because I learned on equipment that your manuals don't cover, under conditions that your manuals don't address, fixing problems that your manuals don't acknowledge exist." She returned to her work, removing the damaged accumulator assembly with movements that looked effortless, but required intimate knowledge of the system's complexities. "Danny, hand me that seal kit from the military parts inventory. Kevin, start preparing the hydraulic fluid flush equipment. We're going to clean the entire system before reassembly." Mike Sullivan, who had been observing from the office doorway, approached with obvious amazement. "Carmen, in all the years you've worked here, I've never seen you move this fast or with this level of authority, I guess." "Because you never asked me to work on anything that required this level of expertise," Carmen replied without looking up from her repairs. "Brake jobs and oil changes don't require the skills I learned keeping vehicles operational during combat operations." Captain Mitchell stepped closer, his professional curiosity overriding military protocol. "Ma'am, can you walk us through your diagnostic process? Our junior mechanics could benefit from understanding your methodology." Carmen nodded, continuing her work while providing a real-time education in advanced vehicle maintenance. Military hydraulic systems operate under extreme stress conditions, so failure patterns are more complex than civilian applications. You start with pressure readings, but you also listen to pump cycling, feel for vibration signatures, and check fluid contamination levels. She demonstrated each technique as she described it, her hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of repetitive practice under pressure. Most importantly, you never assume that the obvious symptom indicates the actual problem. Combat operations teach you that systems fail in cascading patterns. One component failure creates stress on other components, leading to secondary failures that mask the original issue. The education she was providing was worth years of formal training, delivered with the practical insight that could only come from extensive field experience. The Rangers took notes, recognizing information that could improve their own unit's maintenance capabilities. Brooks, meanwhile, was experiencing what could only be described as professional vertigo. The woman he'd dismissed and marginalized for 8 years was demonstrating expertise that made his own skills look rudimentary by comparison. "How long will the MRAP repairs take?" Johnson asked, checking his watch against their movement timeline. 45 minutes for complete system rebuild and testing," Carmen replied confidently. "Then I'll move to the HMMWVs. The transmission problems are more straightforward. Military transmissions in these configurations typically fail due to torque converter issues that civilian shops don't encounter." She was already mentally organizing the repair sequence for all 5 vehicles, applying the kind of systematic approach that military operations required. Each repair built on the previous one, with timing and resource allocation calculated to maximize efficiency. Kevin Walsh, who had been assisting with obvious fascination, voiced what everyone was thinking. "Carmen, watching you work is like discovering we've had a master craftsman doing apprentice-level work for 18 years. Why didn't you ever show us you could do this?" Carmen paused in her assembly work, considering the question seriously. "Because showing you would have required explaining how I learned these skills, and explaining that would have meant discussing experiences I wasn't ready to talk about." Her voice carried a weight that spoke to the psychological cost of her expertise. Every advanced technique she demonstrated had been learned in conditions where mechanical failure meant life or death for people she cared about. "Ma'am," Turner said quietly, "for what it's worth, we understand that kind of adjustment. A lot of us struggle with transitioning from military to civilian work. Skills that were critical in combat don't always translate to peacetime applications." Carmen nodded acknowledgement, then returned to her work with renewed focus. The MRAP's hydraulic system was nearly complete, and she had 4 more vehicles to address before the Rangers' departure deadline. As she worked, the dynamics in Sullivan's heavy-duty repair continued to shift. Carmen was no longer the overlooked mechanic taking orders from Brooks. She had become the expert everyone else was learning from, and that transformation was changing everything about how the shop operated. The demonstration of her true capabilities was just beginning, and it would reshape not only this particular repair job, but the entire future of everyone who witnessed it. By the time Carmen had completed repairs on all 5 military vehicles, 2 hours ahead of her promised timeline, word of what had happened at Sullivan's heavy-duty repair was already spreading through the military community with the speed that only truly exceptional events could generate. Captain Mitchell had made 3 phone calls during the repair process, each conversation becoming more animated as he described what he was witnessing. "Sir, you need to understand," Mitchell was saying into his satellite phone, speaking to someone at Fort Bragg. "This civilian contractor just diagnosed and repaired complex hydraulic failures that our own mechanics couldn't handle. We're talking about expertise that rivals our best depot-level technicians." Staff Sergeant Johnson stood beside the now fully operational MRAP, running final diagnostic checks that confirmed what everyone could already see. Carmen had not only fixed the problems, but had optimized the systems beyond their original specifications. The hydraulic response was smoother, the pressure readings more stable, and the overall performance noticeably improved. "Ma'am," Johnson said, approaching Carmen as she cleaned her tools with the same methodical precision she'd applied to the repairs. "I need to ask you something directly. Would you be interested in consulting work with military contractors? Because what you've demonstrated here represents capabilities that are in extremely high demand." Carmen paused in her tool organization, considering the question that could change everything about her carefully constructed civilian life. "Staff Sergeant, I appreciate the offer, but I left military work for specific reasons. I'm not sure I'm ready to go back to that world." "With respect, ma'am," Turner interjected, "what you've shown us isn't just military expertise. It's problem-solving ability that could benefit any organization dealing with complex mechanical systems. You don't have to return to combat zones to apply these skills." The conversation was interrupted by Mike Sullivan, who approached the group with obvious excitement mixed with concern. "Carmen, I've got 3 phone calls in the last hour. Word is getting out about what happened here today, and people are asking questions about our capabilities that I'm not sure how to answer." Carmen looked at her employer with something approaching sympathy. Mike had run an honest shop for decades, providing reliable service within the limitations of his staff's abilities. Now he was facing the possibility that his most overlooked employee might transform his entire operation. "What kind of questions, Mike?" Carmen asked. "Defense contractors wanting to know if we can handle specialized maintenance contracts, other military units asking about our diagnostic capabilities, and—" Sullivan paused, clearly struggling with the implications. "A reporter from the local paper asking about the quote 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 XLA quote 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 XLA quote 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 quote." The shop had fallen silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what was happening. Carmen's 18-year period of invisibility was ending abruptly, replaced by attention that could reshape not only her own life but the entire dynamic of Sullivan's heavy-duty repair. Brooks, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since watching Carmen's demonstration, finally spoke up with obvious frustration. "So what happens now? Does Rodriguez suddenly become the lead mechanic? Do I get demoted because she decided to finally show off her military training?" The question hung in the air, touching on the complex workplace dynamics that Carmen's revelation had disrupted. Brooks's competence hadn't changed, but his relative status certainly had, and everyone in the shop was trying to understand what the new hierarchy would look like. Carmen turned to face Brooks directly, her expression carrying no malice but also no accommodation for his wounded pride. "Ryan, you're a skilled mechanic who knows civilian systems well. That hasn't changed. But you've spent 8 years treating me like I was barely qualified to change oil, when I've been quietly fixing problems you created and preventing others you didn't even recognize." The accusation was delivered calmly, but its impact was devastating. Brooks's face reddened as he realized that his professional reputation had been built partly on Carmen's invisible contributions to his work. Kevin Walsh, who had been documenting the day's events with obvious fascination, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Carmen, what do you want to do? You've got options now that you didn't have this morning." It was true. In the space of a few hours, Carmen had gone from being an overlooked maintenance worker to someone receiving job offers from military contractors and attention from media outlets. The comfortable anonymity she'd maintained for 18 years was gone, replaced by opportunities that could lead anywhere. "I need time to think," Carmen said honestly. "This morning I was changing oil and planning to do the same thing tomorrow. Now I'm being offered consulting contracts and interviews with reporters. It's a lot to process." Captain Mitchell approached with obvious urgency. "Ma'am, I hate to pressure you, but I need to submit my after-action report about today's repairs. Command is going to want to know if you're available for future contracts." "What should I tell them?" Carmen looked around the shop that had been her workplace for 18 years, taking in the faces of people who were seeing her with completely new understanding. Mike Sullivan, who had employed her fairly but never recognized her potential. Brooks, whose professional confidence had been shattered by the revelation of her expertise. Kevin and Danny, who were looking at her with newfound respect and curiosity about what she might teach them. "Tell them," Carmen said finally, "that I'm considering my options, but also tell them that any work I do will be on my terms, applying my expertise in ways that align with my values and experience." Staff Sergeant Johnson nodded approvingly. "Ma'am, that's exactly the kind of response I'd expect from someone with your background. Military experience teaches you to evaluate opportunities carefully before committing." As the Rangers prepared to depart with their fully operational vehicles, the reality of what had happened began to settle over everyone present. Carmen Rodriguez was no longer the invisible mechanic who could be assigned routine maintenance and ignored. She had revealed herself to be an expert whose capabilities exceeded those of anyone else in the shop, and that revelation would have consequences that none of them could fully anticipate. Turner approached Carmen with a business card bearing official military contact information. "Ma'am, regardless of what you decide about consulting work, I want you to know that you've earned the respect of every ranger in this unit. If you ever need anything, references, recommendations, or just someone who understands your background, don't hesitate to call." Carmen accepted the card with genuine gratitude. For 18 years, she had carried her military experience as a private burden, something that set her apart from civilian colleagues who couldn't understand the context of her expertise. Now, for the first time since leaving the service, she was being acknowledged by people who understood exactly what her skills represented and how they had been earned. As the convoy pulled away from Sullivan's heavy-duty repair, Carmen stood in the bay where she had spent thousands of hours performing routine maintenance while hiding capabilities that could have transformed her career. The choice ahead of her was complex: continue the comfortable anonymity that had protected her from painful memories, or embrace opportunities that could utilize her expertise while potentially exposing her to the very experiences she had spent 18 years trying to forget. The phone in Mike Sullivan's office was already ringing with inquiries about the shop's newly revealed capabilities, and Carmen knew that whatever decision she made would affect not only her own future, but the lives of everyone who worked alongside her. 3 days after the Rangers' visit, Sullivan's heavy-duty repair looked like a completely different operation. The parking lot, which typically held a steady rotation of civilian trucks and the occasional military vehicle, now hosted a collection of specialized equipment that attracted curious looks from passing motorists. More significantly, the shop itself had been reorganized around Carmen's systematic approach to complex repairs, with dedicated areas for diagnostic equipment and specialized tools that had been gathering dust for years. Carmen had made her decision on Tuesday morning, arriving at work with a proposal that would transform not only her own role but the entire capability of Sullivan's operation. She had agreed to take on consulting contracts and specialized military work, but only under conditions that allowed her to maintain the psychological distance she needed while sharing expertise that could benefit others. "Mike," she had said, approaching Sullivan's office with the confidence that had emerged since her revelation, "I'll take on the advanced work, but I want to establish a training program for Kevin and Danny. They've got the aptitude to learn these systems, and having multiple qualified technicians will allow us to handle larger contracts." Sullivan had agreed immediately, recognizing that Carmen's expertise represented an opportunity to elevate his entire operation beyond the routine maintenance that had defined it for decades. But the real transformation began when Carmen started teaching, and her colleagues discovered that her knowledge extended far beyond the technical skills she had demonstrated with the Rangers. Kevin Walsh became Carmen's first formal student, and his education began with a fundamental shift in how he approached mechanical problems. Instead of following diagnostic charts and repair manuals, Carmen taught him to think systematically about how complex systems functioned under stress conditions. "Kevin," Carmen explained as they worked together on a civilian diesel engine that had been giving the shop trouble for weeks, "military maintenance taught me that manuals are starting points, not final authorities. Equipment operates in conditions that engineers never anticipated, which means you need to understand principles rather than just procedures." She demonstrated by diagnosing an intermittent fuel injection problem that had stumped both Brooks and the engine's owner for months. Instead of replacing components according to the troubleshooting flowchart, Carmen analyzed the system's behavior patterns and identified a timing issue that resulted from wear in multiple components working together. "See how the injection timing varies under load?" Carmen asked, pointing to diagnostic readings that Kevin had learned to interpret differently under her instruction. "That's not a single component failure. It's accumulated wear in the timing chain, fuel pump, and injection controller, creating a compound problem that manifests as intermittent symptoms." Danny Martinez, initially intimidated by Carmen's expertise, discovered that her teaching style focused on understanding rather than memorization. Unlike Brooks, who expected apprentices to follow his instructions without question, Carmen encouraged Danny to analyze problems independently and develop his own diagnostic reasoning. "Danny," Carmen said during his second week of advanced training, "tell me what you think is causing the transmission slippage in that Ford pickup. Don't worry about being wrong. Just walk me through your reasoning process." Danny studied the vehicle's symptoms, applying the systematic approach Carmen had been teaching. "The slippage is most pronounced during acceleration from a stop, but it smooths out at highway speeds. That suggests the problem is in the torque converter lockup mechanism rather than the transmission bands." "Good analysis," Carmen confirmed. "Now, what would cause that specific failure pattern?" "Contaminated transmission fluid affecting the hydraulic control circuits that manage converter lockup." Exactly right. And what's your next diagnostic step? Check the fluid condition and run a pressure test on the hydraulic control system. Carmen nodded approvingly. Danny had progressed from someone who followed repair procedures by rote to a technician who could reason through complex problems using fundamental principles. The transformation was remarkable, but it represented exactly the kind of educational approach that military training had taught Carmen. Develop understanding that allows adaptation rather than memorization that requires constant reference. Brooks, meanwhile, was struggling with the new dynamic that Carmen's emergence had created. His position as lead mechanic remained officially unchanged, but his authority had been undermined by the obvious superiority of Carmen's knowledge and teaching ability. Customers were beginning to request specific technicians for their work, and increasingly, those requests centered on Carmen and her students rather than Brooks and his established methods. The situation came to a head during the shop's weekly staff meeting, when Mike Sullivan announced that they had received their largest contract in the company's history, maintenance support for a convoy of military vehicles participating in extended training exercises. "This is a 6-month contract worth more than we typically make in a year," Sullivan explained. "But it requires certification for advanced military vehicle maintenance, which means our technicians need to demonstrate competency with specialized systems." Brooks saw this as an opportunity to reassert his authority. "Mike, I've got 15 years of experience with heavy vehicles. I can handle the certification requirements and supervise the military contract work." Carmen looked up from the diagnostic manual she had been reviewing, her expression carefully neutral. "Ryan, military certification requires demonstrated competency with specific systems under standardized testing conditions. It's not based on years of civilian experience." The comment was delivered without malice, but its implications were clear. Brooks's civilian experience, while valuable, didn't translate directly to military vehicle maintenance certification. Carmen's background, meanwhile, made her the obvious candidate to lead the certification process. "So what are you saying?" Brooks asked, his frustration evident. "That I'm not qualified to work on military equipment?" "I'm saying that qualification for this kind of work is based on demonstrated competency with specific systems, not general mechanical experience," Carmen replied calmly. "But I'm also saying that competency can be learned if you're willing to approach it systematically." The offer was both generous and pointed. Carmen was willing to teach Brooks the same advanced techniques she was sharing with Kevin and Danny, but only if he was prepared to acknowledge that his previous assumptions about his own expertise might need revision. Kevin Walsh, who had been observing the tension between Brooks and Carmen, spoke up with the diplomatic skills he'd been developing. "Brooks, I've been learning from Carmen for 2 weeks, and it's been incredible. She's not trying to replace what we know, she's showing us how to build on it." Danny Martinez nodded agreement. The stuff Carmen's teaching isn't just about military vehicles. It's about understanding how complex systems work under stress conditions. "It's making me better at civilian work, too." Mike Sullivan, recognizing the opportunity to resolve workplace tension while maximizing his shop's capabilities, made a decision that would define the operation's future direction. "Here's what we're going to do," Sullivan announced. "Carmen will lead the military certification program and supervise specialized contract work. But everyone who wants to participate in the training is welcome, and everyone who achieves certification will be eligible for the premium pay rates that military contracts provide." It was a solution that acknowledged Carmen's expertise while providing opportunities for others to develop similar capabilities. Brooks could maintain his dignity while learning new skills, Kevin and Danny could continue their advanced education, and the shop could maximize its ability to handle the complex work that was increasingly coming their way. Carmen nodded approval of Sullivan's approach. Military experience had taught her that successful operations required everyone to contribute their best capabilities, and that meant providing opportunities for growth rather than maintaining rigid hierarchies based on past experience. The training program that emerged over the following weeks would transform Sullivan's heavy-duty repair from a competent local operation into a specialized facility capable of handling some of the most complex mechanical challenges in both civilian and military applications. 6 weeks after the Rangers' visit, Carmen Rodriguez found herself sitting in a conference room at Fort Bragg, surrounded by military contractors, defense officials, and senior Army personnel who were eager to understand how a civilian repair shop had become the region's most sought-after facility for specialized vehicle maintenance. The meeting had been requested by Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's logistics commander, who had received multiple reports about exceptional repair work being performed by a contractor with unusual expertise. "Ms. Rodriguez, Colonel Hayes began, consulting a thick folder of performance reports and contract evaluations. In 6 weeks, your facility has successfully completed maintenance on 47 military vehicles, with 0 comebacks and an average repair time that's 30% faster than our depot-level facilities. That's unprecedented performance from a civilian contractor. Carmen nodded acknowledgement, but her attention was focused on the broader implications of the meeting. Military recognition at this level typically led to opportunities that could transform careers, but it also meant exposure to the institutional structures she had deliberately avoided for 18 years. Colonel, our success comes from applying systematic diagnostic principles and maintaining high standards for repair quality, Carmen replied carefully. We treat every vehicle as mission-critical equipment, because that's the standard military operations require. Major Robert Chen, the base's maintenance officer, leaned forward with obvious interest. Ms. Rodriguez, your background includes extensive experience with combat vehicle maintenance. Have you considered returning to military service in a civilian contractor capacity? The Army has several positions that would utilize your expertise at a much higher level than routine repair work. The offer was exactly what Carmen had been expecting and dreading. Military contractor positions would provide better compensation, more challenging work, and recognition for her expertise. But they would also require her to operate within the institutional framework she had left behind, working directly with the military systems and personnel that triggered difficult memories. Major, I appreciate the offer, but I've built a good situation at Sullivan's, Carmen said diplomatically. We're able to provide excellent service while maintaining the kind of work environment that suits my needs. Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with her staff, recognizing the polite deflection that military personnel used when declining assignments for personal reasons. But she had another approach that might prove more appealing to someone with Carmen's background. Ms. Rodriguez, what if we could structure something that allows you to maintain your current working arrangement while expanding your influence on military maintenance training? We're developing new curricula for vehicle maintenance specialists, and your practical experience could significantly improve our training effectiveness. The suggestion was intriguing because it addressed Carmen's core motivation, sharing knowledge that could save lives, while allowing her to maintain the psychological distance she needed from direct military involvement. What kind of training involvement are you considering? Carmen asked. Consultant work, Major Chen explained. Periodic visits to review training materials, input on diagnostic procedures, maybe some hands-on instruction for our advanced technicians. You would remain a civilian contractor working from your own facility, but your expertise would influence how we prepare thousands of mechanics for deployment. Carmen considered the proposal carefully. Training military mechanics would allow her to share hard-earned knowledge without requiring her to return to the institutional environment that had become psychologically difficult. Most importantly, it would ensure that future mechanics developed skills that could prevent the kind of catastrophic failures that had cost lives during her own service. I'd be interested in discussing that kind of arrangement, Carmen said finally, but I want to maintain my current responsibilities at Sullivan's and ensure that any training work focuses on practical applications rather than theoretical concepts. The meeting continued for another hour, with discussions about contract structures, training schedules, and the scope of influence Carmen's expertise could have on military maintenance operations. By the time she left Fort Bragg, Carmen had agreed to a consulting arrangement that would triple her income while allowing her to remain based at Sullivan's heavy-duty repair. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. As Carmen was leaving the base, she encountered Staff Sergeant Johnson, the ranger who had first recognized her expertise during that transformative day 6 weeks earlier. "Ma'am," Johnson said, approaching with obvious enthusiasm, "I wanted to let you know that word about your capabilities has spread throughout the special operations community. We've got units requesting your services specifically for pre-deployment vehicle preparation." Carmen paused, understanding the implications of Johnson's statement. Special operations units represented the highest level of military professionalism, and their equipment requirements exceeded even standard military specifications. Working with special operations would mean applying her skills to their absolute limit while contributing to missions that could affect national security. "Staff Sergeant, that's flattering, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of involvement with military operations," Carmen replied honestly. Johnson nodded understanding. "Ma'am, I get it, but I want you to know that the work you're doing is already affecting operations. 3 different Ranger units have specifically requested vehicles serviced at Sullivan's before deployment because they trust your maintenance standards more than depot-level facilities. The conversation revealed something Carmen hadn't fully considered. Her expertise was already influencing military operations, whether she intended it or not. Rangers were making equipment decisions based on her reputation, which meant her work was directly contributing to mission success and personnel safety. When Carmen returned to Sullivan's that afternoon, she found the shop bustling with activity that would have been unimaginable 2 months earlier. Kevin Walsh was leading a diagnostic session with 2 junior mechanics who had been hired to handle the increased workload. Danny Martinez was supervising the installation of specialized equipment that had been purchased to support military contracts. Even Brooks was engaged in advanced training, working to achieve the certifications that would allow him to participate in the shop's new capabilities. Mike Sullivan approached Carmen with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "Carmen, I've got 3 more contract offers on my desk, including one from a defense contractor that wants exclusive access to our services. 6 weeks ago, we were struggling to stay busy with routine maintenance. Now we're turning away work because we can't expand fast enough." Carmen looked around the shop that had been her professional home for 18 years, taking in the transformation that her revelation had triggered. What had started as a place to hide from her military past had become a bridge between her expertise and a new kind of service that honored her experience while respecting her psychological needs. "Mike," Carmen said, "I think we need to talk about expansion plans. If we're going to handle this level of specialized work, we need to do it right. Better facilities, more qualified technicians, and systems that can support the kind of precision that military contracts require." Sullivan nodded eagerly. "Whatever you think we need, Carmen, you've already transformed this operation beyond anything I thought was possible." As Carmen prepared for another day of applying expertise she had hidden for nearly 2 decades, she reflected on the unexpected path that had led her to this point. The quiet mechanic who had spent 18 years avoiding attention had become a recognized expert whose influence was spreading throughout the military maintenance community. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it represented an opportunity to ensure that her hard-earned knowledge would continue saving lives long after her own career ended. Sometimes, Carmen thought, the most valuable service comes not from hiding expertise, but from sharing it with people who need it most. 1 year after the Rangers' visit that changed everything, Carmen Rodriguez stood in the expanded facility that had once been Sullivan's heavy-duty repair, watching a new generation of mechanics apply techniques she had developed during her years of hidden expertise. The shop had grown from 4 bays to 12, with specialized equipment that rivaled military depot facilities and a staff of 18 technicians trained in advanced diagnostic procedures that were now being adopted throughout the defense maintenance community. The transformation was remarkable by any measure, but what struck Carmen most profoundly was the change in the people around her. Kevin Walsh, who had begun as a curious apprentice asking innocent questions about her background, was now a certified instructor teaching military maintenance techniques to mechanics from 3 different states. Danny Martinez had completed advanced training that qualified him for specialized contracts with defense contractors, earning more in his current position than most civilian mechanics could expect in an entire career. Even Brooks had undergone a transformation that neither of them could have anticipated. His wounded pride had eventually given way to genuine respect for Carmen's expertise, and he had worked harder than anyone to master the advanced techniques she taught. The arrogance that had once defined his interactions had been replaced by the kind of professional humility that came from understanding how much there was to learn. "Carmen," Brooks said, approaching her workstation with a diagnostic report that would have been beyond his capabilities a year earlier, "the MRAP hydraulic system is showing some unusual pressure readings. I think it's accumulator seal degradation, but I wanted your opinion before I started the repair." Carmen reviewed his analysis with the same careful attention she applied to all training situations. Brooks had correctly identified the problem and developed an appropriate repair strategy, but more importantly, he had recognized the limits of his certainty and sought expert confirmation rather than proceeding with overconfidence. "Your diagnosis is correct," Carmen confirmed, "but check the filtration system before you replace the seals. This failure pattern sometimes indicates contamination that needs to be addressed to prevent recurrence." Brooks nodded gratefully, his response demonstrating the kind of collaborative professionalism that had replaced the competitive dynamics that once characterized the shop. Carmen had created an environment where expertise was shared rather than hoarded, where learning was valued more than ego, and where everyone's capabilities were maximized through mutual support. The morning brought a visitor who represented the full scope of Carmen's influence over the past year. Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived unannounced, but her presence at the shop had become routine as the facility's reputation spread throughout military maintenance circles. "Carmen," Colonel Hayes said, "I wanted to personally deliver some news that I think you'll find interesting. The training protocols you developed have been officially adopted by the Army Logistics Command for all advanced vehicle maintenance programs. Your diagnostic procedures and systematic approach to complex repairs are now being taught at military schools throughout the country." The announcement represented validation that went beyond personal recognition. Carmen's expertise, developed through years of combat experience and refined through 18 years of civilian application, had become institutional knowledge that would influence thousands of mechanics for decades to come. "Colonel, that's gratifying to hear," Carmen replied. "But the real measure of success will be whether those techniques help mechanics solve problems and keep vehicles operational when it matters most." Hayes smiled at Carmen's characteristic focus on practical outcomes rather than institutional recognition. "Actually, we have data on that too. Maintenance units using your procedures show 40% fewer vehicle breakdowns during training exercises and 60% faster repair times for complex system failures." The numbers represented lives saved and missions accomplished, the kind of impact that military service was supposed to achieve, but often failed to measure effectively. Carmen had found a way to continue serving without wearing a uniform, applying her expertise in ways that multiplied her influence far beyond what individual service could accomplish. As Colonel Hayes departed, Carmen reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 18 years earlier, she had arrived at Sullivan's seeking anonymity and psychological safety, hoping to build a life that kept her military experience safely in the past. She had succeeded in that goal, but at the cost of hiding expertise that could have benefited countless people who needed exactly the knowledge she possessed. The Ranger's visit had forced her to choose between continued anonymity and the responsibility that came with exceptional capabilities. The choice to reveal herself had been difficult, but the results had validated her decision in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Mike Sullivan approached with the quarterly financial reports that demonstrated the business transformation Carmen's expertise had enabled. "Carmen, we're booking more revenue in 3 months than we used to make in an entire year. But more importantly, we're doing work that actually matters, maintaining equipment that keeps soldiers safe and missions successful." Carmen nodded, but her attention was focused on deeper measures of success. The mechanics trained in her techniques were now teaching others, creating a multiplying effect that would spread her knowledge throughout the maintenance community. The systematic approach she had developed was being incorporated into training programs that would influence military readiness for generations. Most significantly, she had found a way to honor her military experience without being trapped by it. The psychological distance she needed had been maintained, but her expertise was being applied to its fullest potential. Kevin Walsh, now preparing to establish a second training facility in Virginia, approached Carmen with obvious gratitude. "Carmen, I wanted you to know that everything I've accomplished over the past year traces back to that first conversation when I asked about your background. You could have continued hiding your expertise, but you chose to share it instead." Carmen looked around the bustling facility where 18 mechanics were applying advanced techniques to maintain equipment that would support military operations around the world. The quiet woman who had spent 18 years changing oil and rotating tires had become the foundation for an operation that was influencing military readiness at a national level. "Kevin," Carmen said, "expertise that isn't shared eventually dies with the person who possesses it. Military service taught me that knowledge belongs to the mission, not to individuals. It just took me 18 years to figure out how to apply that principle in civilian life." As the day concluded, Carmen performed the same tool organization routine that had marked the end of her workdays for nearly 2 decades. But everything else had changed. The overlooked mechanic who had been dismissed and underestimated had revealed herself to be exactly the expert that her colleagues and the military community needed most. The transformation had required courage, the courage to abandon comfortable anonymity and accept the responsibilities that came with exceptional capabilities. But it had also required wisdom. The wisdom to find ways of serving that honored her experience while respecting her psychological needs. Some stories end with dramatic revelations that change everything instantly. Carmen's story was different. It was about the patient application of expertise over time, building trust and demonstrating value until recognition became inevitable. Most importantly, it was about understanding that true expertise isn't measured by personal achievement, but by the positive impact it has on others who need exactly the knowledge you possess. The quiet mechanic had finally found her voice, and that voice was now teaching thousands of others to keep critical equipment operational when lives depended on mechanical reliability. Some legacies are built through dramatic action, but others are built through the patient sharing of knowledge that makes everyone more capable of handling the challenges they face. Carmen Rodriguez had chosen the latter path, and the results would benefit military operations and save lives long after her own career ended. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.